Okay, guys, so we've been talking about what's going on in the Pacific and in Europe as far as fighting. Let's find out what's going on. So back at home, the economy booms. Remember, we're coming out of a depression, and when we go into war mode, we are making stuff. Factories that have been closed are going to be reopened. They're going to be revamped. They are going to be making war supplies, and this is going to be a boom to our economy. But we are going to be short on certain items that our troops need. So this is actually going to end up people saving money because more people are going to be working, but they're not going to have as much. With 15 million men going into the military, much like in World War I, if you recall, more and more people who were not working are going to go into the workforce. So you're going to have younger people, teenagers, minorities that had had trouble getting jobs before, and women. Lots and lots of women are going to start doing the jobs that men were doing before. So sometimes when this happens, we suffer something called inflation, where people start raising prices on rent and other items. So in order to stop this, we form a new government office called the Office of Price Administration. And basically it put in rent control. It said that you could not raise prices on basic goods and items. And this is going to keep suppliers honest, and it's a good thing. And some of these rent restrictions are actually still in place in places like, if you wanted a brand new tire, they were rationed. They need these tires for supply trucks and Jeeps and all sorts of military. So there's going to be a very limited supply of things, rubber products like. They're going to start rationing other items that, again, are going to be used for the military, things like coffee, sugar, meat, butter. My mother always talked about how she was only allowed to get 2 new pair of shoes a year, and she used to actually trade her ration stamps of cigarettes so she could get more shoes. She loved her shoes. Tires, gasoline, silk, and remember, stockings were made out of silk back then. They didn't have nylon pantyhose, so women actually started painting their legs because they couldn't get silk stockings. And they were given ration books, and so if you went in to buy something, you had to have a stamp and pay for it as well. Kind of looked like this. So depending on the size of your family, you would get a certain number of books, and depending on type of job, you would get a book that would ration your gasoline as well. So you can see here, this is a sugar book, and then you've got coffee, and then you've got some called spare, and those would be extra items that sometimes were available, things like flour and sugar and so forth. This is people actually standing in line, and this was taken, from what I understand, in Mansfield. And you're basically going to take what you can get. If you can get chicken, then you're in line, and you might get a whole chicken if you're in the front of the line. And by the time it's in the back of the line, it's chicken necks. So this war is going to be very, very expensive, much more expensive than World War I. We're going to spend $321 billion between 1941 and 1945. So once again, how do we pay for it? Much like we paid for World War I. They're going to sell Liberty bonds, and just about everybody is going to be buying Liberty bonds. And they are going to put a higher income tax rate on. People will continue to grow victory gardens. If you recall, that's growing food for their own family, so they don't have to buy in the stores and more is available. And every week at the theaters, absolutely free, people could go. Remember, there's no TV back then, but people could go to the theaters and they could see what was going on with the war. They actually had servicemen that were tasked with taking films and giving the war news to the people back home. One thing they never showed were any dead bodies or any caskets. Everywhere you looked, you would see propaganda posters encouraging people to conserve, plant a victory garden, conserve food. You can see this is very patriotic. It makes people feel like they are part of. Another government office that's going to be established is called the Office of War Mobilization. And basically they figure things out. Okay, we need to buy 15 million boots and shoes for the new military people. So they get a contract, they let people bid on it, or not really. What they do is they let people say, okay, this is what it would cost us. And they can put in the overhead, the material, the amount that they have to pay their workers, and they come up with a cost. Okay, this is what it cost us to make a pair of shoes. And then they multiply it out. So the government will pay whatever it costs them plus 10%. Back in World War I, the government was paying way too much money for things. Industry was taking advantage of the government, and this was put in place to keep that from happening. We wanted industry to be able to make a little money, but we didn't want to have them cheat the government. So this was watched pretty carefully, and a guy named Harry S. Truman is actually going to be in charge of that when it's originally put. This is an example of women working in industry, and you can see this is very patriotic. So propaganda was a very important part of the home front, and even Hollywood was involved. You can see these posters, red, white, and blue, avenge Pearl Harbor, calling on people to liberty bonds. Even Dr. Seuss got involved, and you can see his caricature here of Adolf Hitler and Tojo here on the right. And he's asking the American people, what have you done today to help save your country from them? And that's encouraging people to conserve, to buy liberty bonds, to be patriotic. Again, you can see the propaganda showing the Japanese here is kind of dark and glowering, and you can see all the workers in the background, and they're encouraging people in the war industries to work hard and work hard to smash the enemy. Again, you got Dr. Seuss, the caricatures. You can see the little eyeglasses and the squinty eyes. He says, man who draw his bath too hot, sit down in same very slow. So you can see the Japanese has now at war with the United States, and perhaps the message is, has he gotten into what? Yes, hot water. We have Captain America fighting for liberty, and we are defeating those Nazi maggots. So you can see the wording that's once again, the caricature here with the buck teeth and the squinty eyes. And this, you can see the dripping knife here and he's holding in the back, and the Nazi swastika. Good material, waste, and scrap help to saving face for Jap. So again, conserve, recycle, the message. A lot of people that were in the entertainment industry wanted to help out with the war effort. And so the USO, the United Service Organization, was formed, and it was formed to entertain the troops. And it's going to expand and do other things as well, but these are movie stars, musicians, comedians, entertainers that travel to the front, and just for a break in the day-to-day fighting and just all the things that the Army has to go through, the men have to go through, the boredom of it, they entertained them. And the USO is still in existence today. They do a lot of other things too. If you ever, you can see that they've got coffee shops set up. This is an aircraft carrier. You can see the guys all up there, and this is a group of dancers that have come to entertain the USO set up coffee houses, places where And like I said, in airports, they've got lounges where servicemen can go with Wi-Fi and coffee, maybe even a place to rest. They were segregated. So back in World War II, our troops were segregated, and these USO organizations did have segregated facilities. Again, you can see the entertainers here that have gone to entertain the troops. Remember we had the It Girl in the 1920s, we had Clara Bow. Well, in the 1940s, during World War II, this was the It Girl. Her name was Betty Grable, and she was an actress and a model, and she was painted on a whole lot of airplanes. So Betty Grable, kind of the It Girl of World War II, and they were known as pin-up girls because they would pin up her pictures in lockers and inside their trunks. So during World War II, minorities served in the service. One of the most famous of these minorities were the Tuskegee Airmen. There was a need for pilots, and these young men would train at the Tuskegee Institute. Remember Booker T. Washington, who had been part of that Tuskegee Institute, still around today. Well, they trained there. They went through more intensive training counterparts, and they are going to become bomb escort pilots. And these are basically fighter pilots as well, but they're going to escort the bombers and protect them on their. So they're going to train almost 1,000 Tuskegee Airmen, and during the course of the training, 992 are going to graduate, and 150 ultimately will die in battle. But they never lost a single bomber. They're going to be sent mostly to Italy and escort bombers on their runs into Germany. And at first they experienced a lot of prejudice, but then ultimately they were requested because they were so good at their jobs. So they were highly decorated at the end of the war. This is A. Philip Randolph, and A. Philip Randolph was the kind of the Martin Luther King of the 1940s. He was a prominent civil rights leader, and he is going to be a good friend of Eleanor Roosevelt. He's going to meet with Franklin Roosevelt and complain that people were being paid different wages if they were minorities or if they were women than white men in these industries. And he convinces FDR to pass Executive Order 8802, and that is if any industry had a government contract, which was a majority of them back then, they had to pay people equal pay for equal jobs. This was a very big deal. He's going to come up with something called the WW campaign. And he says, okay, we're not going to protest during the war. What we're going to do is we're going to serve, and we are going to achieve victory. And then after the war is over, we want victory in the civil rights. We want an end to segregation, and we will fight for victory. So he calls it the WW campaign, victory in the war, and then when the war is over, victory at home. Native Americans, the Navajos. Navajos have no written language, so when they learn their language, they learn it from childhood, and nobody but the Navajo could speak it. There was just there's no books in the Navajo language. So hundreds of these Navajo joined the Marines, and they basically were talking to one another, and this was the kind of code, and no Japanese could break it. They never figured it out. These guys were highly valued, and actually service members were assigned to them to make sure they were protected because they were so valuable. Actually we even use them in Vietnam, the Navajo. So this is a group of Navajo code talkers, and so one would maybe be on a ship, one would be with a unit, and they would be able to coordinate activities. This is kind of the black spot that we're going to talk about, the Japanese internment. And in California, we had lots of Japanese people, and of course after Pearl Harbor, great animosity and the Bataan Death March towards the Japanese. Many were born right here in the United States. They were what they called Nissi, okay? And if you think native and Nissi, that's a good way to remember them. The Issi were first Japanese Americans that had come to America. But FDR issues Executive Order 9066. And in this executive order, he said that all these Japanese people in California would be sent to relocation centers and basically interned during the course of the war. This is an example. It's almost like a prison. You can see the dust here, mountains in the background. We had an internment center in Arkansas. We had several, because you're talking about 100,000 people, and they were given a period of time to get their business put together, to pack what little belongings they were allowed to take, and to move. And you can see here, this is an example of one who had to sell his business and put a sign up, "I am an American," but that didn't matter. They were sent in. Even Dr. Seuss thought that this was a good idea. You can see here's a guy, Japanese obviously, handing out TNT, or bombing material, and you can see that they're looking at the coast of California, and the message is waiting for the signal from home. So he's saying that, they are not to be trusted. This speaks for itself. It goes to the Supreme Court. This is a Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus the United States. And the Supreme Court rules, if you remember back to Schenck in World War I, the court case where Schenck said his rights had been violated when he opposed the draft, they reference the same thing. They say if there is a clear and present danger, the United States has the right to take away rights. And this is very controversial. Again, remember the time. It's World War II. People are angry at the Japanese. This court case will be overturned in 1983, and the Japanese people will be offered monetary reimbursement for the time that they spent. Not much, but a little bit. Our last group we'll talk about are Mexicans and Mexican Americans. With all these people leaving, we still need people to pick crops in California, and lots of Mexicans will come up over the border to fulfill. Some of these folks lived in gangs, and they wore something called zoot suits. You can see here, this is kind of like a gang thing. And they had these pegged pants, these long coats, and sailors would get off the boats. This is in San Diego and Los Angeles, but they actually picked fights with these Mexicans. They're fighting in a war, and these guys are wearing long hair, and they start fights. And basically, they pass a law saying no more zoot suits because of this 4-day riot that occurred between the sailors and the Mexicans. Here's our symbol of women. Okay, this is Rosie the Riveter, and Rosie is the symbol of women in the workforce. Lots and lots of women went to factories that were typically done by men in the past, and then this is the more modern Rosie, and basically we can do it. They encourage women, red, white, and blue again, very patriotic, to come to work war effort. Women were also encouraged to volunteer, to fight, not fight, but to be with the fighting forces, and this is Women's Army Corps. They were mostly office workers, and on the Navy side, it was the WAVES. You don't need to know that. It's an acronym. And finally, this is showing what our spending was like. You can see that it was almost all military spending during this time period. So this is going to be a 2-day lesson, y'all, and just put your notes together, and then we will move on to the actual fighting.